Our scripture reading today comes from the book of Job, chapter 42, verses 1 through 17. Listen to the word of the Lord. Then Job answered the Lord, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. You said, Who is this that consoles without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to see, which I did not know. You said, Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you declare it to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes see you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord who said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is kindled against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Now, therefore, take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up for yourselves a burnt offering, and my servant Job will pray for you. For I will accept his prayer, not to deal with you according to your folly, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has done. So Eliphaz the Temanite and Bildad the Shiite and Zophar went and did what the Lord had told them, and the Lord accepted Job's prayer. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Then there came to him all his brothers and sisters and all who had known him before, and they ate bread with him in his house. They showed him sympathy and comforted him for all the evil that the Lord had brought upon him, and each of them gave him a piece of money and a gold ring. The Lord blessed the later days of Job with more than his beginning, and he had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first Jemiah, the second Kizerah, and the third Kerahapons. Forgive me. In all the land there were no women so beautiful as Job's daughter, and their father gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. After this, Job lived for 140 years and saw his children's children 4 generations. And then Job died, old and full of days. This is the word of the Lord.
John always gets those passages, and he keeps agreeing to read scripture, and I don't know why. I promise I'm not doing that to you on purpose. Didn't he? You did a great job, right? Hey, these seminarians take like years and years of Hebrew. They can't do anybody knows.
My apologies to my coaches.
So, what does a happily ever after look like in a story marked by suffering? Beyond wishing to be able to go back in time, beyond wishing that the past could somehow be re-scripted, beyond crying out for a cosmic do-over that won't come, What could the best case scenario for someone like Job be after all that he's been put through? And what is our best hope for Job? And from what we've read this morning, did he get it? Now, as you remember, God allowed for Job to lose nearly everything. His livelihood, his health, his children. And in his grief, he was left with a wife who thought he might be better off dead, and friends who insisted that the only logical explanation for his suffering must be that Job had sinned, and was either tragically forgetful or else lying about it, and therefore deserving of what he got. Job's friends couldn't grasp any other understanding for his situation. Suffering must mean retribution. Sin begets punishment. And if suffering happened to a guy like Job, who walked the line of righteousness so carefully, even to the point that he regularly offered sacrifices for the potential sins of his children, if suffering happened to a guy like that, it couldn't mean that their understanding of the system was wrong. No, is that ever what we assume first? It couldn't mean that maybe suffering doesn't actually have anything to do with sin. If suffering happened to a guy like Job, it couldn't mean that we have to admit that we can't explain everything. No, even with all the evidence to the contrary, this must be because Job deserves it. And if he would just come clean, all of his suffering would be reversed. Now, they had probably understood things this way for a very long time. And other people that they respected probably thought this way. They probably had seen just enough evidence to convince them that this old way of thinking was irrefutable, even in a situation like Job's, which refuted it plenty. And wouldn't life be so much easier if this, in fact, was the way things worked? Wouldn't it make so much more sense if people got what they deserved and didn't get what they didn't deserve? Wouldn't it make so much more sense if our most generous, selfless friends were the ones who won $1.6 billion lottery prizes? And if those who ate right and exercised and led the healthiest of lives never received unexpected tragic diagnoses? And if people that we know who are the most capable of love never dealt with infertility or losing children? If people of faith never had to worry about their sacred spaces being shattered by violence? But suffering doesn't show us who the sinners are, any more than good fortune shows us the saints. Inexplicably, it seems the other way around. But here we are today at Job's happily ever after. In the end, Job's good fortune is restored and twofold. Friends gathered around, money in the bank, and so many camels. And 10 brand new kids to boot. They all lived happily ever after until Job died old and full of days. And this is the ending Job deserved, right? That God would recognize Job's goodness and wave a magic wand and make things the way that they were before. But could things ever really be the way they were before? On the other side of Job's suffering? And even if they could, what about all that Job went through? What about the unfairness of it all? And do 10 new kids wipe out the despair of losing 10 others? Doesn't Job's suffering count for something? Yes. The restoration of Job is 7 quick verses compared to the chapters upon chapters of Job's suffering and lament and arguments from his so-called friends. And finally, God's long-awaited response from the whirlwind comes. And so, if we aren't paying attention, the end of this myth reads kind of like the last 5 minutes of your favorite sitcom or movie. Just tying everything together, all the loose ends, very quick and tidy, even as the credits are already beginning to roll. Isn't it funny that for literal millennia, we've been telling stories like this? Dragging out the drama, only to get to the quickest resolution in the end, a fast track to remedy. We seem to have something hardwired in us that lights up when we hear a story do this. When a rom-com leads us from the meet cute through 2 hours of high drama, will they, won't they, hijinks, we all know how it's going to end up. And by the time the music swells and they have the big moment, the kiss or the proposal or the I love you, we aren't thinking, oh, I hope this movie goes on for 30 more minutes. And I hope that they show what happens next. Those first few months of the relationship, the first fight, I hope that they show when stuff starts to get really complicated. And when things get a little boring. I hope there's another 30 minutes of the movie that goes there. No, we're already headed out the door with our empty popcorn buckets. We're satisfied when the kiss comes. We don't need to know anymore. We don't need to know how the messes that were created in the 2 hours of hijinks really get cleaned up. And we certainly aren't up for any more complications. The drama has led to resolution and we are satisfied. But it's a false satisfaction, right? Saccharine. Like sugar-free gum when what you really want is a Snickers bar. And I don't think that this is the kind of satisfaction that Job gets. When we pretend that our theology of why bad things happen can be boiled down in any way, like good people get good things, bad people get bad things, it might give us a temporary saccharine satisfaction. When we encounter someone who is suffering and we come through with an easy answer of everything happens for a reason, as if those answers could actually make anyone feel better, it might give us this temporary saccharine satisfaction. When I'm hurting and I feel like God is far away and I convince myself that there's a formula that I just have to find and follow, some magic trick, something I could do to just fix it, I'm hoping for that temporary saccharine satisfaction. But this isn't what Job gets in the end. There's one thing that Job has been asking for through all of the chapters of lament, that he could have an audience with God. He wanted to be able to lay out his case for God, to tell God all the reasons why what was happening didn't make sense, didn't fit into the system that he knew. And Job knew that if he could just get a chance to explain to God how the world worked, that God would understand and relent. And finally, after what seems to be an eternity, God answers Job. But as Rory showed us last week, God answers Job's questions with more questions. These rhetorical questions meant to remind Job and to remind us that God is not, in fact, asleep at the wheel, but also that the existence of mysteries we cannot fathom or pieces of the puzzle that we cannot make fit does not mean that the world is being mismanaged or that chaos has triumphed. As if to prove the point, God rides in on a whirlwind in order to speak to Job about the wildly gargantuan creatures and the wildly undomesticated world that God has created in order to reassure Job that God really still is in charge. Old Testament scholar Ellen Davis puts it this way. What God says, in effect, is this. Look away from yourself, Job. Look around you. For a moment, see the world with my eyes, in all its intricacy and wild beauty. The beauty is in the wildness, Job. You cannot tame all that frightens you without losing the beauty. God calls this man of integrity to take his place in a ravishing but dangerous world where only those who relinquish their personal expectations can live in peace. The price of peace is the surrender of our personal expectations, which are always too small for the huge freedom built into the system. Davis goes on to say, the great question that God's speech out of the whirlwind poses for Job and for every other person of integrity is this. Can you love what you cannot control? Can you love what you cannot control? Job, who offered sacrifices for his children just in case they sinned, yeah, Job knew something about loving that which was beyond his control. To live a life centered around love instead of one centered around control ends up having a lot more to do with freedom and a lot less to do with certainty. And freedom is uncertain, unpredictable, and dangerous. But isn't the satisfaction of love far greater than the saccharine satisfaction of merely being in control? Job's final word to God, which is translated here to take the form of confession, can also mean something more like if Job, in the strength of his humility, were to say, I thought I knew how things worked, but I see more clearly now. And I take back what I said, and I change my mind. And what is the evidence of this change of mind? First, God reprimands Job's friends and tells them that Job had been right in the way that he spoke to God, railed against God, lamented to God, cried out to God. Job was right in doing that. And Job was right about God. And the friends had been dead wrong. God instructed the friends to go to Job to offer a burnt offering on behalf of their behavior. And God told them that Job would pray for them. It's a pretty good deal for the friends. Tough for Job. Now, I didn't say that Job had to hang out with these guys that had been so callous and hurtful to him, or that Job owed them anything beyond his prayers. But Job did do this revolutionary thing of praying for them. He prayed for these so-called friends, which probably felt a lot like praying for his enemies. And then the text tells us that the Lord restored the fortunes of Job. So many camels. And that all those who had deserted him then returned to his company and sought his good graces. And that Job had 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. But let's slow that down for a second. This didn't happen overnight. These things never do. There's no magic wand. The ending had to get shoved into these short 7 verses because apparently that's the only way that we humans know how to deal with a story. But consider just how long it would take to rebuild a successful business if you had to start over from the ground up. The fortune restored to Job wasn't oxen and camels, but rather the incredible patience and fortitude it takes to rebuild a life. Consider what it would take to be able to look your friends in the eye and accept their well wishes after seasons of being ghosted and ignored and pitied. The fortune restored to Job was the grace and the strength to rebuild even those relationships. Consider what it would take for Job to have more children. To show the courage to love in spite of all that we are unable to control. And to have these children not seeking to double down on all the ways that he might keep them fenced in and safe, but rather to embrace a spirit of freedom. These names that John read, these untraditional names translate as dove and cinnamon and horn of eyeshadow. They're names for these daughters that are named when the sons are not. Names that spoke to the wild and domesticated world that God has created. You thought modern baby names were weird. And Job not only bore witness to love and freedom in the naming of his daughters, but in bucking the patriarchal system that declared women to be of less value than men by giving his daughters their own inheritance alongside their brothers, making them more than just someone's daughter or someone's sister. Job stood with them against oppression with the authority that his own suffering had bestowed on him, in order to say, as he said to God, I thought I knew how things worked, but I see more clearly now. This is love. On the other side of the suffering that he would have never wished for, Job was transformed in ways that he could have never imagined. And Job's humble confession to God wasn't merely a resignation and an acceptance of the way things were. It was an entering into God's creative work of building and rebuilding a wild, untamed world where systems break and ideologies are deadly And those things are set aside for the freedom to love as recklessly as God loves us. And what better hope could we have for Job? What better hope can we have for ourselves and for those we love? But that we might be transformed. That in seeing the advocate and the adversary, the friend and the enemy, God who is God, but who also suffers alongside us, to see all of these pictures as one. The same God who loves us fully, who seeks after a relationship with us, as risky as that is, and yet gives us all the freedom that we can grasp. That in getting a glimpse of this God, even with all the mysteries we'll never solve, we might be empowered to love when it is difficult, to love in new ways, to love when we cannot be in control, to love beyond what we are capable of on our own. Well, better hope then that our fortunes might be restored, our cups filled to overflowing by a God that we cannot hem in or pin down, a God that we cannot fully understand, but a God who does show up for us. What better hope can we have than the hope that suffering would not be for nothing, and that we are not consigned to temporary, saccharine satisfaction, but the hope that from death nothing less than new life springs up. My life flows on in endless song above earth's lamentation. I hear the clear, though far off hymn that hails a new creation.